Welcome to the broadcast. I'm Armstrong Williams. Have you ever heard the name Christopher Bolin? Some say he's anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, disguised as a journalist. From campuses of Harvard to Cornell, all across this country, there's really no justifying these insane claims about 9/11, and assuredly none to justify this anti-Jewish rhetoric. It's just none. Now, Bolin believes that 9/11 was orchestrated by Israel as a false flag operation in order to trick the United States into believing that Arab Muslims were the cause. Now, this would in turn cause the United States to attack these Arab nations, wiping them off the map, ensuring that Israel's strategic interests were met. Let me just tell you this. There are a lot of people who believe that Israel knew about 9/11. What they don't tell you is that in their biblical teachings, they talked about this 9/11, and a great financial nation would fall to people that would invade through air. And they took this passage to believe just before 9/11 that it would be a day of wreckage and deaths. And so they decided to leave the United States and move away based on scripture, nothing based on facts, no different than people who believe that the flood was coming with Noah. There are people who are very steep in their faith that believe that the Bible and the prophecies are fulfilling. And so after all, this journalist has been espousing these claims on 9/11 for decades, and he seemingly had made this his life works in his articles, these key Zionist points of 9/11, where he outlines those key points. But let me just, all this conspiracy stuff, and I'm joined by Victoria and Bruce and our guests on Zoom, all this, Rob Bluey and Patrice Onwuka. I find it fascinating, and I want to start with you, Patrice, because I want to get into a little history here. And I don't know if people realize the many Muslims that fought along Adolf Hitler in World War I. Nobody talks about that. They seem to want to erase that Arab history, and nobody wants to talk about the fight of the Arabs in slavery, especially Mauritania and throughout Africa, that nobody wants to talk about anymore, as if it sweeps it under the rug. And people feel that the Palestinians in the Arab world are marginalized, they're victims, so we have to embrace them. But do they really understand what they're embracing and who've been our true allies and who've stood with freedom and progress throughout history?
Yeah, good to see you, Armstrong. It's so interesting because the history that gets repeated by those who are supporting Hamas right now is the history that just dates back to the foundation of Israel as a nation. But you can go back into biblical history and recognize that the descendants, Jews today, as well as Arabs and Palestinians, are descendants of the sons of Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac. And so this conflict has been centuries, probably millennia going on. It's not just something new, but you hit on a point about this idea that all marginalized people, all people of color, are somehow oppressed, and anything that seems to be representative of whiteness or colonialism should be viewed skeptically and should be rejected. And so unfortunately, that is a very basic, lacking understanding of the nuance and frankly of history. But unfortunately, that's what a lot of journalists, a lot of social media influencers and celebrities are spouting, because they simply think that everyone somehow with brown or colored skin is oppressed, and they're willing to turn a blind eye to the brutal, barbaric, murderous activities that we've seen coming from Hamas. And by the way, Hamas leaders themselves say this is not the end. The idea of calling for a ceasefire will not stop them, because they plan to commit more October 7th style attacks against Israel and against Jewish people around the world until they're wiped out. That should not be anything anyone stands behind.
Victoria?
I think, as Patrice pointed out, we just don't teach history now. There's so many people that have opinions on things that they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. They haven't studied the history. They haven't been to the region. I've been to Israel, and I can tell you that when you go down the street, the street signs are written in Hebrew, in English, and in Arabic. And Israel, as a country, even though it is a Jewish state, it is very multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And, you know, even in Jerusalem itself, you have the quadrants for people of different religions. And so these people have coexisted side by side within Israel, outside of Israel for decades. But for some reason, when somebody throws a match into the fire, it ignites. And this is what we're seeing today with the Israel and Hamas conflict. And opinions on social media, I think, only seek to exacerbate that.
You know, Rob Bluey, former presidential candidate, Secretary of State, and First Lady Hillary Clinton issued a statement recently saying, at all costs, Hamas must be destroyed. You can talk about laying down arms and ceasing this conflict all you want, but that is not what Hamas is thinking. And the fact, and she said, I know this is going to alienate me from my base, but it has to be said. Even her husband, former President Bill Clinton, said during those negotiations where he was trying to bring about a two-state solution, even in his conversations with Arafat on camera, giving lip service that he wanted a two-state, off camera, he told the president himself, and this is in his book, if I push a two-state solution, they will kill me. That would never happen. That's not what they want. How is it that all this, from people who've been on the cutting edge of this, from the left to the right, how is it so lost on just students on college campuses and these protests you see from London to China all around the world about who and what Hamas is? And what it tells us, Rob Bluey, they continue to win the propaganda war.
Certainly are, Armstrong. It's really disconcerting that for now more than a generation, college professors have been indoctrinating students with this belief. And you see it playing out on these social media videos and other examples that we are seeing on a daily basis at these Ivy League schools and right here in Washington, D.C. with Georgetown University as well. So it is of deep concern. This debate of good versus evil seems pretty crystal clear to you and me, Armstrong, but not other people. And I think that there are some steps that we can take. First of all, these university presidents can put their foot down and fire those who are anti-Semitic and outright anti-Jewish in their not only teachings, but their social media posts. And secondly, where are the donors? There are a lot of donors who obviously don't agree with the beliefs of these university professors. Why are they still funding these colleges and universities? They need to cut off the funding and send a strong message that this will not be tolerated.
You know, Bruce Fein, I want to go back to the history of how we get to this place we call Palestine, and how do we fight the propaganda? I mean, even the New York Times, when the hospital was first bombed at the start of the conflict, their headline was the next day, Israel bombs hospital in Gaza, killing scores of people. And then Reuters and other major news dailies followed this narrative. And then all of a sudden, they had to change it. Even the president of the United States himself, Biden, was outraged and incensed by it.
Well, he was. I'm not sure. You know, they say journalism is the first draft of history. At least they had the decency to correct the misstatements and the after study of the evidence to suggest that it was highly unlikely. It's more likely an errant Hamas rocket or something like that. I think, however, you know, if you want to go back to the history of Palestine, I don't think it's a history of peaceful coexistence. In part because you have different peoples claiming different territories. As we noted earlier, every boundary in the history of the world is drawn by the sword. It's not drawn by self-determination, and that you have votes between the Muslims or the Arabs and the Jews in 1948 to decide what the boundaries would be. And I think it's a little bit simplistic to paint the world here in prime colors. It's not at all to defend the horrors of Hamas, but to suggest that the West comes with clean hands. We had slavery, Amritsar, all sorts of atrocities happened in wartime. And David Ben-Gurion, who's not a representative of Hamas, the first prime minister of Israel, he was the founder of Israel, said he could understand the Arabs. We came, we took their land, we believe in our God gave us this land, they don't believe in that, so what do you expect? And he says, if I were an Arab, I would never sign a treaty with Israel. And to be fair as well, talk about a two-state solution. Netanyahu is not in favor of a two-state solution. Hamas isn't either. But I don't think either side favors a two-state solution.
I don't want people to think that you're justifying Hamas's
of course not.
Vicious attacks.
No, I'm not. I'm just trying to put it into. No,
I get that, but where does it stop? Who stands up and say? Let me just say. This is the question that you bring me to. Yeah. What is war? Yeah. War is a legal license to kill innocent civilians in a very ghastly way. We did it in Dresden. We did it with the fire bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We do it in wars, and tens of millions of people die, and it's justified. No different than what's going on in Gaza when the Hamas killed these innocent people at these festivals and threw out Israel for no reason at all, and now Israel is doing the same. And they said this is collateral damage. This is what happens when you declare war. Innocent civilians die.
Yeah, and not only that, I think the real casualties are far higher than the ones who are directly killed in war.
Where the water and food is cut off in the medicine?
Yeah, you got no food, medicine, you got no shelter, you got no hope. Yeah, so you die at age 23 instead of at age 83 or something of that sort. Now you ask, well, how is this going to stop? Well, the history of mankind, unfortunately, is a history of war stops, and then you have intermissions, and then war begins again. That's why Lincoln called it the greatest scourge in the history of mankind in his second inaugural address. I don't have any solution to the constant warfare. Unfortunately, I say, and Lincoln also said, it's the brightness of military glory. It's like the serpent who charms before it destroys. And I don't think that whenever this war concludes, it's not going to be the end of war, that's for sure. It was said that World War I was going to be the war to end wars, and then we had the Kellogg-Briand Pact that make war illegal. It didn't stop anything. We're into Manchuria, we're into Ethiopia, then we're into Poland within years. And that's a far, far more difficult challenge than certainly just the Gaza issue. And again, I'll repeat because I don't want anyone to understate or disbelieve that I think what Hamas did were out-and-out war crimes. Two wrongs do not make a right.
I'm Armstrong Williams, and we will be back. Patricia, why hasn't Egypt and other Arab states fully opened their borders to fleeing Palestinians?
Well, I think they want to keep a neutrality for the time being. I do think they'll probably start to. I believe that some of the Egyptian border has been open to refugees fleeing, but I don't think they want the problems. I don't think they want many Palestinians to be in their borders. They don't want to deal with the refugee crises that come with that, and sheltering and bringing and feeding folks and trying to get them resettled if in case this is a long and protracted war. So I think that's why they're trying to play that neutrality and reduce the burdens on their own citizenry.
Rob, it's fascinating. Just recent, you had almost 1 million refugees fleeing Afghanistan. You have tens of thousands fleeing Syria. And yet there's barely a whimper about it in the media. And all of a sudden, because you have hundreds of thousands fleeing Gaza as refugees, it gets all the coverage in the world. There's a tinge of hypocrisy here. Why? While others, which is far greater crisis in Afghanistan and Syria, but yet it's all the news about the refugee crisis that Israel is causing as a result of its literally flattening Gaza.
Well, I think you're right to pinpoint the hypocrisy, Armstrong, and I think it goes back to our conversation about colleges and universities. If they are the ones training journalists and they are feeding them propaganda and information that indoctrinates them to a pro-Palestinian point of view in journalism school, well, of course they're going into jobs where they will espouse that same belief in those roles. So I am not surprised. I think that what's most concerning is there is a pressure here in the United States to bring some of these Gaza refugees to our country. and we don't have the process to properly vet them, to ensure that they're not terrorists. We already have an open border along the Mexico, where we know that terrorists are entering our country. We've apprehended them. And so I think it's alarming that some of the neighbors in the Middle East won't even take these refugees, but they are pressuring the United States to do the same. It's something that we need to be very mindful of and call out at every opportunity.
You know, Victor, isn't it ironic? Israel gave up Gaza, and you look, fast forward to see how they built the tunnels underground. They really set up a government and an infrastructure to destroy Israel. I mean, and when you think about the open borders that we have here in the United States, and it seems like there's just no end in sight. Don't you think at some point the Biden administration should wake up and say, look, we need to get our borders under control, because we could have the same chaos right here on American soil, because we know they want the next Gaza to be in a major city like New York or Los Angeles?
Well, as I mentioned several weeks ago when I was on your show, Armstrong, I think the people within the Biden administration are actually waking up to the fact that public opinion is telling them that it is time to secure our border with something like a wall, a physical barrier. Now a majority of Democrats, a majority of Republicans always have thought this, but now even a majority of Democrats and a majority of independents see this, and they want the Biden administration to put a stop to it. And I think that pro-security candidates, whether they're going to be in the House, in the Senate, running in the presidential race, I think that bodes well for them, because I think the Biden administration won't be able to convince people that they've changed their tune when they have individuals like Alejandro Mayorkas still in charge of the DHS, where, I believe the number most recently was over 9 million illegal crossings have happened since the start of the Biden administration, and that number is completely unacceptable, and Americans of all political stripes are realizing that they don't want this.
Patrice Onwuka, what did the Fed tell us recently?
Well, the Federal Reserve, they decided not to halt interest rate, do another interest rate increase. So I don't think we're going to see higher rates, at least for another month or so. I think the Fed recognizes that the jobs market seems to be strong. And with Q3 growth coming in at 4.9%, which is higher than the Q2 rate of 2.1%, the economy is strong. People are still there's tightness, a little bit more tightness in the jobs market. And so and inflation has come down from its 9.1% high in 2022. But that doesn't mean that it's where the Fed wants it to be at about 2.5%, 2%. And so I think the Federal Reserve is signaling that maybe there's a possibility of a soft landing where there wouldn't be a harsh recession. That said, the spending bump that we saw this summer, I think, and I've written a piece that hopefully will come out very shortly, that was driven by a lot of once-in-a-lifetime spending by women on concerts like Beyonce and Taylor Swift, but it's not going to be sustainable. And elevated prices still continue to hold back the U.S. household, still continues to be a drag on the U.S. economy.
Rob Bluey, the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is in the crosshairs of the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, over the legislative agenda. How can this play out?
Well, he certainly is. He's wasted no time taking a very conservative position, insisting that we have a standalone bill to fund aid to Israel. And I don't think it's an unreasonable position. He knows that that's where the Republican caucus is in the U.S. House of Representatives. And he, of course, was just elected with their blessing to pursue this policy. He's also trying to offset that with some money that would go to the IRS for enforcement. And so he's paying for the aid. Now, this is aid that Joe Biden requested as president. It's aid that Mitch McConnell supports. The difference is both of those gentlemen want to attach it to Ukraine, Taiwan, and border funding. And Johnson is saying, let's handle each of these issues independently. That's the best way to go, Armstrong. That is the best way to legislate. The American people are tired of these big omnibus bloated packages. Over $100 billion was the request that Biden made. This is on top of $113 billion we've already appropriated to Ukraine. I think it's time to ask some tough questions and take these one at a time.
Bruce Fein, Dick Durbin, who's chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, is giving the impression that they're calling in the donors that supported Alito and Justice Thomas Harlan Crow and others to bring them before the Senate because they somehow or another they believe they have some kind of oversight of the Supreme Court. Is this just for the cameras? And are they not three independent branches of government?
Well, they are, but in some sense they're not. Obviously, the U.S. Supreme Court is endowed with authority to say the executive branch or the Congress or both have violated the Constitution and tell them to stop doing what they're doing. So it's checks and balances. No one particular branch operates totally by itself without any checks by another branch. That's why Congress can impeach the president can veto congressional legislation. It's back and forth. It's the equipoise that preserves liberty, the equipoise that the U.S. Supreme Court calls as a structural Bill of Rights. Now, when we go to this, I think we should look at the end game here is to ensure that we have justices whose decisions on all cases are on the merits. They're not compromised by ulterior motives. And no one in all this brouhaha has ever pointed to a single decision any justice, the current bench or in the past, has ever cast a vote because of some ulterior motive, because they were doing a favor for a friend or this or that. Because that's what counts, is the judgment. It's not how they spend their leisure time or how they do vacations or things of that sort. So this is a stunt. It's not going to go anyplace. But sometimes the court is a nice football. That's what Franklin Roosevelt did with his court-packing plan, and even with overwhelming majorities, he was rebuked. I think the American people rendered the verdict in 1938. No, we are going to repudiate you if you're trying to manipulate and weaken the third branch.
You know, Patrice, I saw an article some time ago where Trump's lawyers are already prepared for his second term in office. And if you look at the polls, it does seem that he has an insurmountable lead that's not going to change. But yet, he still faces 4 indictments. He just had, there's a case before the court now dealing with his genitalia about, and the T-shirts about how small. And just, do you think that is there anything out, whether it's the indictments or whatever, that can stop the Trump from steamrolling to the nomination?
No, not for the nomination. Certainly, President Trump, it's his it's his to lose at this point. The point difference between him and his closest competitors, and I think most recently, Nikki Haley is tying with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and DeSantis has dropped something like 10 to 20 points. So the point gap between President Trump and his closest competitors is 30-40%. It's very difficult to overcome. And I think increasingly, when you look at the kind of support that he has, he's always had the four Trumpers, people who will support him no matter what. There are those conservatives who are also, and I would say that's a third. Another third are those who like the Trump policies, certainly didn't like the tweets, didn't like the rhetoric sometimes, but love the policies and want to go back to that. And then I think you have another third, which probably is conservatives, but also may tap into the independents who recognize that prices today are not what they were at the start of January 2021, and certainly recognize they want to go back to that time. Also looking at the foreign conflicts that we're seeing now, they recognize that there were so many peace agreements negotiated in the Middle East during the Trump administration that President Trump was doing something right. So for the nomination, no. Now for the general election, that's another story, but I increasingly begin to think that, and national polling, Real Clear Averages, for example, suggest that President Trump could very well beat President Biden in a rematch.
You know, Rob Bluey, I know you must leave us soon, but I must ask this question of you. What does it say to the United States and to the world that someone who has 4 indictments, flawed, facing all kind of legal entanglements, is trouncing the GOP challengers and could possibly not only get the nomination, but become president of the United States again? Has America become so desperate that it cannot find someone else?
Well, the American people see through it, Armstrong. They recognize that it is an example of this police state that we live in, weaponized bureaucrats in government, lawyers, the prosecutors who are targeting and doing everything that they can to take down Trump. And I think that the American people discount that and they say, you know what, we liked the 4 years that he was in office. We liked the policies that he pursued. We didn't like everything about it. But at the same time, we're not going to let these sideshows get in the way of how they might ultimately vote. But let's face it, Armstrong, we still have a long ways to go. We have a debate next week. We have voting not starting until January in Iowa and then the other states that follow. So a lot could happen between now and then. I think that a best case scenario is that the American people are treated to a substantive policy discussion and we put all these other antics to the side.
Rob Bluey, it's always a pleasure seeing you on the platform. We don't see you enough, but we know you're out doing the work of the people in the space of media. Thank you for joining us. When we return, Robert Hilliard will join the conversation. I'm Armstrong Williams. Don't go away. And welcome back to the broadcast, and thank you so much for joining us. You know, Robert, we were just talking to Rob Bluey with the Heritage Foundation, but talk about Donald Trump not only as the GOP nominee, but as president of the United States again. What does that mean? Bruce Fein, wake up.
I thought you asked somebody else, but I'll tell you exactly what that means.
Tell us what it means.
It means that we are done as a country where the rule of law is king and the king is not law. And let me just give you two examples. And I'm quoting July 23rd, 2019, Mr. Trump. Then I have Article 2 where I have the right to do anything I want as president. Then I jump forward to January 6th, the morning with Mike Pence, the vice president. Mr. Pence, he says, this is Mr. Pence's words, I'm demanding you choose between me and the Constitution. And I don't want you to follow the 12th Amendment and count those state-certified electoral votes. Mr. Trump later has said that he believes in certain crises the Constitution should be terminated, right? That's the emergency powers of Adolf Hitler when he became the Chancellor of Germany. And we simply cannot survive as a nation that has a president who will not honor his oath of office to defend and uphold the Constitution. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump's not the only one who's made some outlandish statements. Mr. Biden, I think, is a good second candidate, but Mr. Trump is unprecedented levels. There is no doubt about it. He said he's going to go after his enemies. He doesn't want due process. And I think it's important to remember, you talk about weaponizing the government against him. Who are the people who said that his claims that this was fraud was no good? His own Attorney General, William Barr. His own FBI director, Mr. Wray. Is one of the most conservative jurists ever who had served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, said, this is lunacy to suggest after 61 cases, judges of all stripes saying, no, there's not evidence of fraud, due process was given, no, the state votes are certified, and no, he's still saying, he wasn't trying to comply. On January 6th, again, he wanted Mr. Pence, his vice president, to choose him over the Constitution. That, ladies and gentlemen, is dangerous.
Patrice, how do you respond to Bruce?
I think it's interesting what he's saying. Certainly, when you have elected to uphold the Constitution at all ends, then that is your responsibility. And Vice President Pence did that. He's paid a price for it. And there are constitutional questions, and I think that's what Bruce is getting at. But there are also political questions, and the politics of it is that Vice President Pence dropped out of the race this week because some will say because of the stance that he took against his former boss. Others will say, really he was his boss light. Maybe without the mean tweets, but the same policy agenda. And so, I think the real question is politically whether there will be a second Trump administration. Right now, it's increasingly looking like that. And then from a policy standpoint, is he going to be extreme in enacting retribution. I think that is President Trump is certainly over the top in his rhetoric, and I think there's some things you could take with a grain of salt. But having recognized that he has had the federal government, state governments, local governments weaponized against him through sundry lawsuits that he's fielding right now, I would hope that he would take that as a lesson not to repeat and kind of continue that tit for tat game.
Armstrong, I just need to respond because I served in the government beginning with Mr. Nixon for well over a decade. My boss wasn't who was in the White House. My boss was the Constitution of the United States. You take a loyalty to the system, not a personality. In Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, you took a loyalty to the Der Fuhrer. That's not how it works here. And so Mr. Pence had his loyalty wasn't to the boss. His loyalty to his oath of office, the Constitution of the United States, and he enforced it under the 12th Amendment. And I think it's a gross misleading to believe that, no, you're just an apparatchik in the government, and whoever the president tells you to do, you should do it even if it's unconstitutional.
And I never said that. No. So I think it's unfair to, I hope you're not correcting me because it's not what I said. I said that politically, the voters have made their choice when it comes to the Republican voters right now about whether Mike Pence was going to be the best candidate for them. Certainly, if they thought that he was, they wanted him to continue the Trump legacy in terms of policy, he would be the #1 contender right now, or even the #2. The fact that he lacked votes, the fact that he lacked money suggests to me that it was more than just policy differences that they had. I never, however, suggested that he should not have continued his oath of office. So I just want to make that clear.
Okay, I just want to make clear I never said anything at all about Mr. Pence's entitlement or justification to win the nomination. I never even addressed the issue. You're entitled to raise it, but don't suggest that I was supporting Mike Pence for the nomination.
Never said that.
Okay, let me come to you, Victoria. What do we know so far about the few decisions and the positions that the new Speaker of the House has taken and the direction Congress is moving now?
Well, I think as we were talking about in the earlier segment, we want bills that are not omnibus bills. We want bills that are more for transparency with the American people, and this issue of funding potential assistance to Israel is one of them. And I think that that is a demand that the conservatives, some might say they're problematic, but they were the ones that ousted former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And I think that that is a promise that these individuals are going to try and hold the new Speaker Johnson to. And he seems to be kind of following the line that they've laid out for him, unlike what Kevin McCarthy did, because if we go back to it, right, Kevin McCarthy did not have a very easy path to the speakership initially. And so the fact that we had quite a robust fight in Congress over the past few weeks, I think is a representative of the fact that the people that first instilled their trust in McCarthy were disappointed, and they wanted to make sure that they had somebody that was going to not disappoint them again. And I think so far he is serving that. We also know that, he is a family man, he is a Christian, he is a conservative. And, there was some hit pieces already about him, about the fact that he hasn't become personally wealthy from the time that he spent in Washington, and the mainstream media is spinning this as a negative. But I think that this makes him so much more relatable to the American people, and that if he, because, I think a lot of the times when we elect representatives, when we first elect them, they are representative of the people, but then when they come to Washington, they lose that initial connection. And, at least to me, it seems that Mike Johnson is very much in tune with what is going on, both in his own district and with people across the country, because he's living through it just like they are.
Patrice, I want to come back to you on the issue of the Federal Reserve, because I think the Bank of Japan sent an ominous warning to the U.S. that no one is really talking about. We can obsess over the Federal Reserve, which is understandable, but I think the Bank of Japan's decision to relinquish control over their government's bond yields is a reminder that what investors do is that we ignore other central banks at our own peril.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with what the Central Bank of Japan said, Armstrong, so I can't speak to that directly.
Bruce?
I think that we vastly overestimate the power, the influence of the Fed over the economy. It has its own ups and downs and cycles. It's a small little portion in multi-trillion-dollar economy. So it tries to hike interest rates. I'm sure it knows what it's going to do. But I'll tell you the one thing that's frightening is we got over a $33 trillion national debt. The interest rate's now climbing on treasuries to 5.5%, pushing the annual carrying charges on that debt well over $1 trillion.
Because nobody's talking about deflation.
Yeah. No, the price is not. I've not seen any price that I paid plunge in years.
Right.
So I'm not worried about, hey, the economy's growing too fast. But I think we endow the Fed with vastly more wisdom than it really contained. You know, it was justifying and had all sorts of plaudits about the U.S. economy just before Wall Street crashed in 1929. And it aggravated, I believe, the problem. So the idea that you can have geniuses out there that can outfox the free market that Adam Smith celebrated, I think is nonsense. Remember, our economy grew faster to unprecedented levels before the Fed even existed in 1913. You had oftentimes Hong Kong became very prosperous. It didn't even have a central bank. So I think we're exaggerating the importance of the Fed and thinking if press a button this or that way, then the economy will go 1, 2, 3, 4. If it really knew what it was doing and had all the answers, we'd have 10% growth rate and 0 inflation and we'd all be living in palaces. And we're not at that stage by any means. It's because they're just guessing and rolling dice like anybody else in the market.
Now, Patrice, sir, please respond.
Well, I agree with Bruce there because, listen, when we consider inflation, when we consider 2020 and 2021, the Federal Reserve was slow to enact any sort of monetary policy changes. Instead, printing plenty of money to support the Biden American Rescue Plan that sent home another round of stimulus checks and additional stimulus spending throughout the economy just when it was reopening. And for quite some time, the Federal Reserve Chairman at that time was, not even considering that, despite warnings from folks like Larry Summers that inflation could rise with this added fiscal spending, the Federal Reserve never considered what the monetary policy was doing. It waited very long, quite some time before starting to change to manipulate the interest rates and to rise and to hike them 20 consecutive times, and now it's starting to slow down. So yes, I do think the Fed has an impact on the economy. Now, can it, to Bruce's point, determine how fast and throttle the economy the way that we would like to believe it? It can. No, it can have an impact, but it may not be on the Fed's timeline, or frankly, nor do they have a crystal ball to know, when exactly things will change from an economic standpoint.
I just saw Robert Hilliard, my man on the screen. There he is. When we come back, he will join the conversation here, Robert Patillo, and don't go away. We'll be back. The economy is important. Let me tell you something. Let me come to Robert Patillo. When you think about Americans struggling, one of the things that we don't talk about is the economy of these wars, the way we're spending money, not just in Israel, but let's not forget about what we're spending in Ukraine. We're still spending in Afghanistan. We're still spending in Syria. We're still spending money. At some point, how is this going to calculate and impact our economy, Robert? Or does it not matter?
It absolutely matters. President Eisenhower warned us about the power of the military-industrial complex over 60 years ago, and today we're seeing it being the one part of the national budget that has become sacrosanct. President Biden raised the military spending from $813 billion to $877 billion, and is set to increase again next year fiscally. If you include veterans benefits, we spend over $1 trillion on our national defense, and in many cases it's only to prop up the military-industrial complex, because each and every single congressperson that has a manufacturing plant in their jurisdiction that benefits from the military-industrial complex will not vote against more military spending. Any congressperson that has a base in their district will not vote in favor of military spending. I think there needs to be a bipartisan effort to audit the Pentagon and audit American contracting. There's no reason that we should be spending $1 billion or $2 billion apiece on B-1 bombers and then building new B-21 bombers, and we still have B-1 bombers and we have B-52 bombers. It's a ridiculous system for a threat that no longer exists, and as long as we have the tentacles of the military-industrial complex going through our government, we will never see true accountability. And it would be much better, I think most people believe, to put at least some of that money into education, healthcare, housing, security, and the private sector.
You know, Victoria, how do conservatives value and interpret the concept of war in today's geopolitical scenario, and how do you respond to some of the concerns that Robert has? And I raise it in this context because, you know what, I don't care what your politics may be, I don't think nobody wants war. Well, I know I don't. As much as I love Israel, and listen, I love Israel, okay, but not to the point where I want there to be war. I don't think nobody wants that.
I totally agree with you, Armstrong. I don't think anybody does want war because it is expensive. Even on the left, we've seen folks saying, oh, Janet Yellen says that we can afford a war on two fronts. Why don't we just get rid of all the student loans, right? So that's kind of a perspective that we're seeing from the left. From the right, I think that we are very frustrated with politicians that will just keep and not really practice that soft diplomacy and want to kind of jump to the final step, which is actually kind of a boots on the ground invasion. I don't think anybody is necessarily talking about it in this scenario, but we were already assisting Israel through our military might. Now, folks are kind of asking, what is the difference between Ukraine and Israel? Why should we spend in Israel and not Ukraine? The issue is that, with Israel, we have long-standing diplomatic processes where actually dollars that we spend in Israel actually come back to U.S. companies. So that is kind of the difference, because Ukraine is newer. These relationships are non-existent, and if they do exist, they're kind of in their infancies, versus with Israel, we have a long-standing kind of partnership in that regard. But the other thing that we do look at is that Israel, at least from the latest things that I've seen, they still want to handle this on their own. And I think many people in the U.S., no matter their political stripes, do want to see Israel handle this conflict on their own, and they don't want to see the U.S. any more involved. Now, I definitely would say that I myself land more in that camp. However, I do think that it is frustrating that we still have, last number I saw was at least 10 Americans being held hostage by Hamas. I think that there are ways that we can do that, through clandestine operations to go out and get these people out. But I do think that that necessarily does not mean a full-scale war, especially, again, if these operations, we only find out about them after they happen, because this is what we're seeing with some other European nations. I believe it was Italy. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was saying that she wants to get Italians out, and we haven't really seen President Biden take a stance that is that strong as we're seeing from other people that have people held in custody by Hamas.
Well, I think he said recently that we want to have sort of a ceasefire with Hamas until we get the hostages out. Patrice and Robert, let me tell you what's fascinating about all of this, or what we do in the media space. If we give all of our coverage to Israel and the conflict there, then Americans believe it's the most important thing in the world. If we're talking about Ukraine and Russia, they believe that's the most important thing in the world. If we focus our attention on the border, or if there's a shooting, sidetrack us from all that, like what happened in Maine, all of a sudden, that's the most important story in the world. But that is what the media believe is important, and that is what the narrative that they push, where America's attention may be. But you and I both know just because it's in the headlines does not mean that's what everyday Americans care about most. So my question to you, beyond the headlines that are pushed on us by people like myself and others in the media, what is it that really is important to the everyday American?
Well, when you look at polling, when you ask people what is their top concern, their top concern still is feeding their family. Their top concern is affordability, and not just of college, but of everyday items, grocery store items, filling their gas tank, being able to afford a mortgage, being at the point for when you look at the generations, Gen Z and millennials, a lot of them think that housing is very expensive, but also the prospect of becoming homeowners one day, very top of mind issue. You know, things like shootings, school shootings, or excuse me, mass shootings do get a lot of headlines, and certainly when they're random, people think, well, can that happen here? Can that happen now? Unfortunately, we have mass shootings in lots of urban and suburban areas on a day-to-day basis that get no coverage and get no play, whether it's because, well, that always happens in DC, that always happens in certain neighborhoods. And so the media has a responsibility to not just present the hot story, but also the local stories, the everyday stories, the personal stories about what's affecting people. And it's important that we have a global perspective and understand what's going on in the greater world. But for most people, it's the world around them, around their house, around their apartment, around their children, that is most concerning for them. And for that, it's about the pocketbook issues.
You know, Robert, does war in any kind of way, the concept, does it intersect with civil rights in your views? Is there something there?
There absolutely is. Remember, Dr. King, prior to making statements on the Vietnam War, was one of the most popular figures in America. When he stood up and gave his speech, Why I Oppose the Vietnam War, is when his national approval ratings dropped down to, I think, 38%. There absolutely is an intersection between civil rights and human rights and what we stand up and say we believe in as Americans when we see it on the international stage. Regardless of the politics of it, I don't think anyone can look at Palestinian children being hit with bombs and just say that we should wash our hands of it, and that's just part of war. We have to enforce the types of civil and human rights that are incumbent in the international system, that all parties follow the rules of the Geneva Convention and the rules of war. We cannot have mass punishment for the actions of a few. And I think that this is why we're seeing such outrage on the international stage, because we understand the plight of the Israeli people and their need to be able to live without fear of rocket attacks or people parachuting into concerts in order to kill them. But I don't think that takes away from the fact that we have to understand the plight of the Palestinian people, who should be able to live without fear of food, water, basic resources being turned off, and them simply being casualties of war because they need to take out a Hamas leader that justifies killing dozens of children and innocent combatants. America needs to be a harbinger for peace. We have to be that shining city on the hill. We've abdicated that duty over the course of the last 2 decades, during the course of our war on terror and our war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We need to rebuild that credibility in the world and stand up and be paragons for peace and to an end of this constant bloodshed. But as long as I said, as long as we are still controlled by the military-industrial complex, we will continue to see perpetual warfare, because that is what's profitable to the war profiteers.
Now, Bruce, Robert packed a lot into that. I know you want to respond. Please.
Well, first of all, of course, as Cicero said many, many millennia ago, in times of war, the law is silent. It doesn't exist. We locked up 120,000 Japanese Americans who were innocent, based on the theory that because there was no evidence of espionage and sabotage in California, then treason must be afoot. I mean, absolutely absurd. It's a decision the U.S. Supreme Court upheld. So, of course, in times of war, after 9/11, we've destroyed all of our Fourth Amendment rights. We've never even talked about it here, Armstrong. The NSA intercepts everything that we do on the digital platform. There's no suspicion. Who they target, they style the not yet guilty, which includes everybody on this program is the not yet guilty that they target. And that's justified because in times of war, even a 1% risk makes you a target for destruction. That's Dick Cheney's 1% doctrine. Now, with regard to war in general and why it's so incorrigible, I put vastly less weight on the idea of people making money. They capitalize on it, to be sure. But the species gets this glory, domination. We want to control. I mean, we see wars between Ethiopia and Eritrea over clods of dirt. And wars began, you go back to the Greek-Trojan War, it was over the Helen of Troy. It wasn't over money. It wasn't over oil or resources. Unfortunately, the human species has this great thrill of dominating others. And even somebody as brilliant as Napoleon would march to Moscow and kill all of his forces in the quest for limitless power. And that's something that we have to change through education and cultivating an understanding that our policy for peace is invincible self-defense, but not 1 cent to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Our influence abroad is the influence of example. No one touches us without risking incineration, but otherwise we're not going to make the species perfect. We're trying to make the optimal freedom for ourselves.
You know, I know people watch broadcasts and it's about war. It seems there'd be nothing good in the world except chaos. And you ask yourself, what gives you hope? Why do I get up in the morning? I know people believe, because you hear this chatter, that all this is going to lead to World War III. But we've been saying, and anytime there's a conflict, it could possibly lead to World War III. We said this about Russia. Russia is no longer the center stage when it comes to conflict in the world. Nah, it's Israel. We don't know where it's going to lead to, but I must tell you, there's definitely cause for concern. But I cannot thank our great panel of the day, Rob Bluey, Robert Patillo, Victoria Churchill, Bruce Fein, Patrice Onwuka, for joining us today in WGLA 24/7. We get through it. We get through it. Thank you for joining us and enjoy what remains of your weekend. I'm Armstrong Williams.